Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to pick up where I left off in the last episode, which was part 4 of my bass guitar build. And if you haven't seen that episode, I'll post a link up here, and you can go back and get caught up. But what I'm going to be talking about in this episode, which is part 5, is I'm going to do a lot of sanding work on the neck and get it ready for finish. And then I'm going to apply the logo to the front of the headstock, and then I'm going to install the frets. So we got a lot to cover. Let's get started. I love woodworking, and that's one of the reasons why I got into building guitars. However, I quickly learned that luthiers and especially guitar players are really particular about the surface quality and the finish of the instruments that they invest so much money into. So I found that I had to take my sanding to a much higher level than I was used to with making other types of projects with wood. And so what I do with guitar building is I will typically start sanding with, I try to start with the finest grit that I can. And because there are tool marks left by the CNC machine, I find that I have to start with about 100 grit. And sometimes I'll even back down to 80 grit. And there have been times when I've gone back as far as 60 grit. But typically the coarser the grit you start with, the more work you have later on to get rid of the scratches that kind of abrasive leaves on the surface of the wood. So I try to start with the finest grit possible. And I'll work my way up to about 400 grit, which is where I'll stop before I apply the finish. Now, a lot of guys will stop at like a 220 grit, and they feel that that's sufficient. However, I find that guitar players and luthiers, including myself, can actually see those 220 grit scratches even after the finish has been applied. So I tend to work a little bit higher grit. I'll go up to 400. And as far as applying finishes, I don't notice any real difference. And I'll use a variety of tools such as rubber sanding erasers, wooden blocks, dowels, that sort of thing, whatever it takes to get into a particular area to sand the surface smooth. And here I'm actually holding the sandpaper with my fingers as I sand just the very edge of the fretboard to give it that comfortable round over shape, which is so much nicer to play. It gives the neck kind of a road-worn feel, like it's been played for a lot of years. And then, of course, I'm not adverse to using power sanding tools to help speed up the process, as well as to save wear and tear on my neck, back, shoulders, elbows, wrists, fingers. I mean, all those joints get sore and tired and fatigued when doing a lot of sanding. So I'll grab the random orbital sander, and I typically will sand usually in the 150 to 220 grit range, and I'll do the finer sanding 320 to 400 by hand, because I like to be able to have that tactile feel between sanding and the surface of the wood. I also like to use an oscillating spindle sander, which makes quick work of getting rid of those tool marks that are in some of the tighter curves that are so prevalent in just about every guitar design out there. When I use these power sanding tools, I make a concerted effort to mitigate the dust that they generate. And what I do is I have a powerful dust extraction system which I can hook up to all the different tools that I use for power sanding. And I also wear a dust mask. And this is really important because, not only is dust a pain to deal with when it gets all over everything, but obviously dust is not healthy for your lungs. But one of the things that I don't hear people talk about very often is the fact that when you're exposed to wood dust on a regular basis, you have the potential to eventually develop an allergic reaction to the wood dust. And when that happens, your future working in wood is pretty much over. As I'm sanding, I'll stop every so often to check the surface, and it's really a good idea to have very good overhead shop lighting. And then I use a technique. It's an Italian term called chiaroscuro. And basically that's the play of light and shadow over a surface. And by using the lighting and examining the surface at a low angle like I'm doing here, you can actually see the quality of the surface that you sanded. With the neck sanded all the way to 400 grit, I was ready to start the next step in the process, which is to apply the Highline logo to the front of my headstock. And to begin this process, the first thing I have to do is seal the wood. And here I'm just brushing on some water-based crystal lac sanding sealer. While the sanding sealer dried, I printed out a copy of my logo laid out onto the design of my headstock. And then I traced the logo onto a material that's known as frisket paper. And what this is a adhesive back clear masking material. And I'm marking the corners of the headstock for positioning purposes. And then I proceeded with tracing my logo onto the front of that frisket material. And then what I can do later on is I'll use that to cut the mask prior to painting the logo onto the headstock. And as you might imagine, it really helps to have a steady hand here. In fact, I usually hold off drinking any coffee in the morning until after I've finished doing this sort of hand tracing work. And with the tracing complete, I was ready to peel the backing off of the frisket paper and then position the mask onto the front of the headstock. And the nice thing about this frisket material is it is repositionable until you have it exactly where you want it. And then once you press it down, it serves as an excellent mask when spraying color over the top of it. And then to create the actual mask, I used a brand new number 11 X-Acto knife blade in my hobby knife and basically just traced over the design with the tip of the knife, pressing just hard enough to cut through the material, but without really cutting too deep into the wood below it. Once the mask was cut, I could then peel away the inside of the logo, which exposes the wood that I'm going to be coating with paint here in a minute. To paint my logo, I just loaded up one of my airbrushes with some black water-based acrylic paint and then sprayed a couple of coats over the entire surface of that mask and let it dry. After about an hour, I could peel away the surrounding masking material and presto, my Highline logo has been painted on the front of the headstock. Since I still have a lot more work to do on the neck, I want to make sure to protect my logo. So what I did was I sprayed a couple of coats of my Crystal Lac water-based sanding sealer just to protect it. Next up is to install the frets. And to do that, I start by cutting a length of fret wire from a coil. Then I'll use a fret radiusing tool to radius that length of wire to match the radius of the fretboard. I'm using stainless steel fret wire, so I find it's very important to make sure that that radius very precisely matches the radius of the fretboard. Each length of fret wire is cut just slightly wider than the fretboard. I want to try to keep the amount of overhang to a minimum because that makes it easier to clean up later on. Now you may have noticed that the slots on my fretboard stop short of the edge, and because of that I have to nip off the tang just from the very ends of the fret wire. And to do that, I'm using a special tool from Symptoms. The Symptoms fret tang nipper makes quick work of nipping that little bit of tang off the ends. However, it does sometimes leave a little bit of residual tang, but it's easy to take it off with a couple of quick passes using a small file. To install the frets, the first thing I do is I apply a bead of water-thin CA glue to the tang. This will help hold the fret more firmly into position into the slot. Then I'll position the fret by hand into the slot, making sure that there's just a tiny amount of overhang on each side. Then I'll use a modified arbor press with a fret caul, and I'll press the fret into the slot. I prefer using an arbor press to press the frets in as opposed to pounding them in with a fret hammer. When I used to do it that way, especially when I was using nickel-silver frets, I always would deform the frets as I pounded them in. This way they're pressed in with even pressure. And once the frets have been installed, I'll grab my nipper and nip off just the very ends of the overhanging fret wire. That'll make the next step in the process a whole lot easier. And that last step, of course, is to bevel the edges of the frets. And I use a homemade fret file which bevels that edge at a roughly 35-degree angle. All right, guys, well, that's all the time I have for this episode, and I hope you found this to be entertaining, inspirational, enlightening, educational, all those good things. If you like the video, be sure to click the thumbs up down below. If you don't subscribe, click subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications every time I post a new guitar building video, and that's usually about once a week. So until the next episode, where I will continue with part 6 of the bass guitar build, I hope you have a great weekend, a great week ahead, and we'll see you soon. Take care.